Hi everyone and welcome to Quilt Stories. I'm Lisa Walton and today I'm chatting to Leslie Tucker Jennison, who's in San Antonio, Texas. And I have been there and it's a beautiful, beautiful city. And I've actually been to Leslie's home and you're all going to be very jealous when you see her studio because we all were when we visited her studio as well. So welcome, Leslie.
Thank you for having me, Lisa. It's so good to see you again. And I'm so happy you were in my studio one time, and I hope it happens again.
One day I hope so too. Yes. And your
Yeah,
beautiful garden. Oh, just delightful. So we're
thank
going to
you.
be talking about a quilt today called interstitial, and I don't think I've said that right. So I think
There we
perhaps
go.
you better tell us what interstitial means first.
This is the sixth in a series of quilts that really have a shape relationship to one another. In a previous life, I was a registered nurse, and I love to look at things microscopic. And this shape reminded me of something I've seen on a slide that you'd put under a microscope. And interstitial means it's an overlay of elements. It's often referring to the spaces between those shapes or the layering of those shapes. It's kind of a odd word, but it's used a lot in medicine. I think there are other applications for it, but that's where the word came from. It because it sort of reminded me of something I'd see on a slide.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So
Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that's what I thought about when I saw it.
here I believe you're at a Nancy Crow workshop.
Yes, I am. I have been studying with Nancy for several years now. It's something I've always wanted to do. I admire her work. I don't want to make work necessarily that looks like Nancy's work, but really, I was up there one year studying with Carol Soderlund and started talking to Nancy. And I told her I'd always wanted to study with her. And she said, "Well, why do you want to study with me?" And I said, I really kind of want you to poke a stick at me and see what falls out. And she started laughing. And I have actually learned a lot of interesting things from Nancy about color and I think generally what I would call engineering of a sewn construction that has unusual forms. She's very excellent technically, and she just really teaches classical design, which is something I'm not art school trained. My background, as I just said, is science based. So I kind of regard studying with Nancy as my sort of self-guided under maybe graduate level design artwork sort of graduate course. And so the reason I picked this particular image to share is because all the pieces that are as you're looking at this picture, they're over my right shoulder, are the pieces I created in her workshop, but there was actually a piece before that sort of informed these pieces. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about the fact that in a series, often when maybe you've had this experience, Lisa, often when I'm working on one piece, I'm thinking, or I'll maybe in retrospect, I'll look at the piece and say, why did I make that decision? Or wouldn't it have been better in terms of construction if I'd made this decision? And so then the next piece is maybe a jumping off point from that. And then there's always something to be learned. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts of doing a series is that often with one piece, sometimes you can make one piece and be satisfied, walk away from it, that's it. But what I find interesting about working in a series is this idea that starts to bubble up in the middle of a current work. And you can't get everything that you're thinking about in some cases included in one construction. There's just not enough room in it for that. So that's where the series becomes an interesting idea. Sometimes things work and maybe you'll try them in the next piece and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I certainly got a couple of examples on that image of things that I felt were successful and some that weren't. So one of the things that I was definitely interested in after doing the 4 that you're looking at here over my right shoulder is how can I think they got a little too complex, and certainly the construction of these was quite daunting. And so I went home and scratched my head a little bit and said, maybe I can think about a way of paring this down and what information is important here, what needs to go, kind of thing.
Okay.
So that's where the piece we're going to talk about kind of, that's the backstory on that.
Right. So you've left the workshop, you've left the barn, and you're now in your workshop at home.
This piece is actually probably should have preceded the last slide, but it's okay to talk about it because I already referenced it. This piece that's on my cutting table that I'm kind of slashing into here is actually the piece that preceded the 4 that were on the design wall. I had looked at it. I tend to obsess over things like, where should I make that cut? You feel like it's such a monumental thing when you've cut into a piece you've worked on, and what if I ruin it? And that gets in the way of everything, that what if I mess it up thing that we do to ourselves. But that's what I'm doing here. I finally decided, well, I'm never going to like it if it's the way it is. I might as well cut it apart and try again. And I'm very glad I did. So that's what I'm doing in this image. And behind me in this image are some black and white, what I refer to as sewn sketches. And those are compositional sketches that are often the jumping off point for something that can become either a combination of that one motif, or it may be a single motif that gets blown up or stretched or distorted in some way. But often these particular sewn pieces are really good information for moving forward in terms of design, in terms of composition. Does the element work if it's turned or flipped? That kind of thing. So that's what those are behind me.
And then we move to this one.
This is my design wall in my studio, and you're looking at a piece on the far left of this shot is a sewn finished quilt, and then the black and white that you see in kind of the right central area is an example of taking one of those sewn black and white sketches and blowing it up and looking at the shapes. And how I do this is I work with cheap black muslin. I use it like paper. And these are my templates. That's what I consider a template. And I will cut the shape. And what I didn't have on this particular image, but often will do, is take about a 1/2 inch piece of fabric and sort of create a frame for whatever these sizes that I'm thinking about working inside of. I didn't have it up there. I think I got so excited by my cutting, I just forgot to do it. But I would probably go back and outline this shape and take it forward from there, because it really does help to have that sort of box to work inside of. And then I use these shapes just like you would any other pattern piece. So if I'm satisfied with my composition after I've changed it or moved pieces around, often what I'll do then is when I start mocking up my color, I'll take the template, whatever shape, whatever part of that piece is, bring it over to my cutting table and use it just like you would any other template. In my case, because I'm sewing these, not fusing, I'm going to put a seam allowance around the edge of that template. So that's how I work.
You seem to work with solids. Is this correct?
In most cases, at some point, I'll probably bring into play some of my own prints, some of my own original stuff, or I might work with some of the fabric that I'm designing for a company. But I find that I feel like this is maybe some of this is student mode, perhaps, but I think there's so much information in these these compositions that I'm doing, that I find that in trying to mock up some things with print, it's tricky. For me, it's actually easier to manipulate the figure ground type of orientation with solids. I have so much that I can play with inside that particular parameter that I feel like prints almost get in the way of that, but it's possibly just a mindset from studying with Nancy. At some point I'll do a little more experimentation with prints and solids in combination, but there's so much that can be done with all the different subtleties of color that feels at this point like enough to juggle.
So another section of your studio, your dry studio.
Yes, it looks rather tidy to me. It's usually a little more, there's a little more stuff laying around often, depending on what I'm in the middle of. This is how, and actually it's interesting. I had Victoria Finley Wolf come to my house and stay with me quite a few years ago. It was right before I was getting ready to remodel my studio space. And before I did the remodel, I used to have my sewing machine was flipped exactly 180 degrees. And I had it around the corner from the site looking out at looking out my window. And Victoria was there and she looked at my setup and she said, why aren't you looking at your design wall? And I thought, yeah, why am I not looking at my design wall while I'm working? I just thought, duh. So anyway, when I came back in after I did the remodel, I set it up in this fashion. I've been so much happier with it. It is really helpful to be able to really look from a distance at what you're doing, because sometimes when you're up close and you're flipping fabric around on the wall and looking back and forth, you can't see certain subtleties until you get a little bit further away from it. At least I can't. So this is my setup. I'm facing my design wall. I have my shelf full of solids and they're sorted according to value, really, from very light in the upper left to the very darkest down in the lower right of the lower shelf. So that's kind of how I work. And I have a variety of, I think you'd think of them as bright dulls. Nancy talks about flat and glowing, which is completely confusing to most people, still to me a little bit. But there's a variety of those mixed into that color, that scale of values, from very, very light neutrals to very, very dark neutrals and everything in between color-wise on the spectrum.
Okay.
So this picture that you're looking at now is me trying to, like, if I've got an idea of how, maybe I've mocked this up already on the wall and I've got large templates up there. The next big question for me is always, all right, you think this is such a good idea, Jennison, now what? You think you're going to be able to put this together? Let's see. And so to really put it, some form of it down on graph paper and try to sort of reverse engineer it, because half of, I think people think of improvisation as very spontaneous, and there's certainly a lot of that. There's a lot of sort of free flowing, free spiritedness about it. But with that comes the reality of, okay, how to construct it, because we're not dealing with paint, we're dealing with sewn seams, often on the bias, and there is a lot of engineering involved. So I think that's where maybe a series comes into play for me, because as I said to you before, with the pieces that led up to the one we're talking about, one of the things I needed to try to figure out is how to engineer it in such a way that it was a little bit easier to construct. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out here. I drew the first sketch, that's the top left, and then I really tried to figure out, okay, what sections, major sections, do I need to be looking at constructing before I do, how do I join them then? What's the sequence of that? And to make them look seamless and get the intervals so they look natural when there's this intersection between them. So that's what I'm trying to figure out with this particular set of sketches. So, and these, what I will often do with these is I will do them on my graph paper, and I'm also taking a lot of photographs. And we all do that with our phone, and thank goodness for our phones and thank goodness for digital photography, because we're so much more free in terms of how many photographs we do take. So I take a lot of progression steps, but I find that it's also really helpful for me to print those steps. So I have a little printer in here in my studio it's a little selfie. I've actually got a couple of little Canon printers. One of them does 4x6 prints, and I've got another one, a new one called an Ivy, a Canon Ivy, and it does little tiny 2x3 prints that actually have a sticky back.
Oh,
So if the information is, if I can get that much compressed into a small image like that, sometimes I'll use that small format, but often I'm using a 4x6 format, and I tape them into my sketchbook. So I take all this stuff and organize it in my sketchbook, so I've got the progression of how I'm working. And I find that sometimes referring to it or just letting it soak in or seeing it through the lens of a camera will sometimes, I'm not sure why that seems magical almost, but sometimes looking at it as a print and then looking up at it, I can often see things when I do this that I can't just see when I'm working. I don't know why this is. I found when I was doing a lot of painting, the same thing was true. I don't quite understand it, but there you go.
it
And well,
works
it's
for
true.
you.
Cameras can see things that our retinas don't see. There is a truth to that. So
Yeah.
that's part of it. But I don't know. Is that something that you have experienced? I mean, do you do that? Do you take photographs and print them out of your progressions?
I take photographs of the progressions, but I don't use them the way you're using them, I don't think. I might do it subconsciously, but it's just really interesting. I shall look at my photos and see if that's what I'm thinking when I'm looking at them.
It is a pretty interesting thing. So, here we go with part of my, I've got my mock-up, and this is a photograph that I took and printed out and put up on my, taped it into my sketchbook. I'm looking at it, I'm looking at the color of it, and I'm just trying to figure out what I've got going here in terms of color. And do I have too much bright? Do I have too much, the sort of the same dull, do I have this too much of the same value? So I'm also looking at them in my camera. This is the thing I think that's so valuable about a camera is I'm looking at the color image, and then I will usually at some point fairly early on get some neutral shots or monochromatic setting shots as well, because then I can look at my value distribution and see if it's what I want it to be.
Yeah.
Because I have trouble with value, especially with reds and greens. I just always confuse them for being darker than they actually are. So that's been a very good tool for me.
Okay, we do have a shot of that coming up in a minute, but we're just jumping into this one.
Okay, so here I'm, looking again at, I've shifted color a little bit, and I'm still messing around with the shapes, and I'm trying to figure out if they look like they're integrating from one part of the upper part of the composition down as these sort of noodles are sort of flowing in the background. And so I'm still playing with that. I'm shifting the color ever so slightly, or I'm shifting the brightness of the color, but I'm trying to stay in the same value zone with those little intervals when they kind of jump under or over something. So that's what's going on here. Okay, and here I've gotten it filled in pretty well, and I'm getting pretty happy with it now. And so now I'm starting to construct. And so I think the first parts of this that I have constructed, the area in the center of this composition where you see the three bands and there's sort of blue, black, blue background. I think that's one of the first areas I constructed. And then also I think the upper left edge and the upper central area. So it looks like maybe I've gotten the bottom section put together too. And I've decided, okay, here's where here are the places I'm gonna intersect these. So yeah.
And here's the value.
Okay, and here's a example of how I really am always fooled by red and often the greens, because they to me, they always, in my head, seem like a darker value than they actually are. So I think it's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
I guess maybe we all have our own point of view on that, but to me, that pink looks darker than, but it isn't. It's really kind of a light medium. So
Yeah.
yeah. So I think it's a valuable thing to look at that. And here's my trusty sidekick, my ladder. Since I'm working a lot larger these days, making these bigger pieces, I find that my ladder gets a lot of action in here. So I have a really good ladder. I think it's a Polar, and I love that kind of high handle it has on it because it makes me feel like I can kind of lean up on it and hands free, and I don't feel like I'm just being some kind of a crazy, you know, acrobat or something out there in the studio. I don't need to be falling off my ladder. That's for sure. No falls. I've got new knees. I don't want to ruin them. So anyway, that gets a lot of action. And then, I'm up and down the ladder a lot, getting these pieces put up and down and, stand back and look, does it look okay? And just, these are the sequence of the piece getting constructed and coming together. And as I said before, working with these, you have to be really careful because you're handling large, in my case, these are long areas of bias. So I try to handle them really delicately and I lay them on the table. And pins are my best friend with these because they're just, it's so easy to stretch that bias that I really just find it's hard for me to get enough pins on something like that. It just stabilizes it. I don't have to worry about accidentally pulling or tugging it. It's going to fit. So before I cut those long pieces, I do chalk registrations on the area before I make the cut. So it goes across both areas. And that really helps me with it. Then I just gently flip one section over. I always work with the concave piece on top and go, I work around with the concave piece over the top of the convex piece when I have a shape like that. So over to the sewing machine we go. And then hopefully when it's put together, I don't have any big unpleasant surprises in terms of ripples and so forth. Believe me, I've had them before. This one came together pretty smoothly. It sewed very nice and flat. So I was lucky.
Here it is.
And there it is before it went. This is pre-quilted, and I have a wonderful long arm quilter. I love doing free motion quilting, but I don't have a long arm, and I do have, I'm starting to pay the price for some of my repetitive motion stuff I've done as a quilt maker and surface design artist. So I am not going to shove a large construction through a domestic machine. Sorry about my dog if you hear her.
No,
but anyway, here it is quilted, and I have found that I'm best off with these large curves if I try not to chase them. So I generally stick with sort of a organic looking matchstick type of quilting on these pieces. I go with a very neutral thread color. I use the same thread color throughout. And I will look at a variety of thread colors, and I always look at them when the construction is up on the wall, because I figure that's how it's going to be viewed. And I mean, these are definitely, I guess it could be a bed quilt, but it isn't. These are quilts to be hung and used as art. So I'm going to choose my thread color based on that position. And so I'll look at what seems to go the best and doesn't contrast too much overall. I'm also using a really small gauge thread now. And I tend to use micro quilter on these. And micro quilter is 100 gauge. It's made by Superior Thread. It's a relatively new product. And I just really love the way it looks. I'm also using a double bat on all these pieces that are hung. And what I found, I have the best luck with this. I'm using Quilter's Dream Orient on the back, on the furthest back of the batting, and that is a silk bamboo blend. And I top that with a Quilter's Dream wool. And that double batting has been wonderful. It has very little heft. I mean, in terms of bulk, both of them are fairly low loft, but the wool layer gives me a little more puff underneath that much stitching. But the best part of having that wool layer in there has been how how difficult they are to get a permanent wrinkle in. They look so much better when they've gone to a show and they've been, I mean, I can't always roll them when they get sent to a show. Sometimes they get folded even as carefully as possible. You know how that goes. Having that wool layer in there has made a tremendous difference in terms of preventing creasing.
I use a wool poly blend.
I suspect it is just as effective as what I'm doing. But this is sort of a new, I guess maybe in the last 3 years, really, for me doing this double bat technique. And I've been so happy with it. I just still have a really low loft quilt, but I have a quilt that just resists those creases. And I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah.
So, and that backing, I think that back layer gives it a little bit more, I don't even know what the word is. I think wool alone is beautiful, but I think it tends to be a lot more flexible. So I think having that second layer gives it a little bit more heft for hanging.
Okay.
So,
right. Is your the thread, is it matching the colors, or is it just a neutral that's going all the way through?
this is a neutral color, and strangely enough, the color of thread that was used on this quilt is sort of a tan color.
Right.
I think people would be very surprised to see the color of thread. It's exactly the same color throughout the quilt. And I decided to go with this tan, kind of a warm neutral is a better way to put it, instead of a cool neutral, more gray tone. I went with this sort of warmer taupey color because I felt like I had enough of those warmer colors in the main parts of the quilt that I thought it looked better overall. The thread itself is the gauge of the thread is so thin that it just sinks in. I mean, sometimes I wonder if I could I'm sure if I use bright red, you would notice it. But it's interesting, the thread just really takes a back seat to the texture, I think.
Yeah.
You don't see the color of the thread so much as you know the thread's there doing its job. And I kind of love that.
So let's just talk a little bit about inspiration.
I would love to talk about inspiration. I'm always fascinated to read about or see or hear other artists talk about what they like to look at. So I always like to talk about that myself whenever given the opportunity. And strangely, I'm fascinated by the effects of pressure on things. In other words, elemental activity like wind, or in the case of this piece, this is a close-up shot of a timberwood frame in Nancy's 1850s era timber frame barn that she teaches in up in Ohio. And I'm fascinated to see not only the cracks that are probably from pressure of the weight of the structure, the weight of the roof on this timber, but also you can see in this image the marks of the maker who used a tool to hand, that's a hand hewn frame, and you can see those chisel marks on the wood. And I love to look at how cracks form. So I'm always taking weird pictures of cracks in the pavement and cracks on the side of buildings and all that kind of thing. I'm just fascinated to see the pattern a crack takes and why does it do that. I'm always fascinated by the physics of that. Equally fascinating, and I love this was actually taken in Tasmania.
Yeah.
This was on Amelia Island in Tasmania, down in your neck of the woods, sort of. And this is a piece of sandstone, and this is the effect of wind on the sandstone, how it blows out those gorgeous shapes and those weird rippling shapes. it's so incredible. It just makes all the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I'm so thrilled to see it. I don't think there's any way you could ever create something like that. I mean, nature is just incredible and how it works its sort of wonderful
Mm,
wearing down of such tough material.
yeah.
I just think it's amazing.
I live in Sydney, which is on a sandstone. It's based on sandstone. So all our beaches have rocks like this, and they're just
Mm,
magnificent to walk around and just see the caves and the shapes and the lines. It's just beautiful. And of
it
course,
is so
plants
incredible.
create beautiful imagery.
Well, this is another obsession, which is the metamorphoses. I mean, if anyone who knows me knows I'm a gardener, and one of the beautiful things about being a gardener, and one of the things I love the best about it, is this whole life cycle process that you get to witness in the garden. And there is no time of year that I'm bored in the garden. Yes, there are times that my garden is more colorful, perhaps, than others. But regardless of that, each season has its own beauty. And one of the things I love, I'm obsessed with these alliums that I have. And unfortunately, this year I didn't get any because we had this horrible storm here, highly unusual weather in February, and we had a lot of snow, and my alliums were coming up rather early, so they kind of they got frozen back, and I didn't get any. But alliums, I think, are so wonderful because they have this little. I mean, they're onions basically. They're in the onion family, and they have this beautiful sort of paper thin little cap, little pointed hat that is on them when they come up, and then the hat opens up, and they look like little old-fashioned Dutch girls, and their little faces peep out, and then you get to see that open up, and then the flower opens up. Every part of it is so incredible to watch. And then each one of these little each one of these little purple buds, these purple and white buds, is a flower, and they open up, and they're so incredible. And then to watch the bees come to them, and I can't get enough of it. I think that the world would be a better place. There'd be no war if we all were gardeners. That's what I think. I think you can work out a lot of your problems in the garden. Now,
Yeah.
this particular plant is a protea, and I had the absolute great good fortune in, I guess it was 2019, to go to well, I went to Africa twice in 2019, but the second time I went, part of the trip was in South Africa. Little did I know that that area in Cape Town, there's a little microclimate, little micro area of where the protea all come from. And I don't know, I can't remember now how many varietals there are, but they're still discovering new ones all the time. So I went to the incredible botanical center in Cape Town and spent my last day there in South Africa, and went around and took all these amazing photographs of the protea that were just starting to open up. Gorgeous, gorgeous, crazy, unusual plants. So I love photographing them, and photography is another passion for sure. And here we're back to the pressure of water on stones. And this is actually in my garden. And I too I live on a very poor excuse for topsoil over hundreds of feet of limestone myself. I live over a huge recharge zone for a uh, aquifer, and that's our city's water supply. So we have lots of limestone, and we have all these. When we start digging in our ground, you don't have to dig very far to get to these gigantic limestone boulders and all these little limestone rocks that have these boreholes in them, made by the force of water filtering through them. And I'm fascinated by them. I have hundreds of them in my I have hundreds of them in my garden that we've dug up, and I could spend the whole day out there just sifting through them, and I'm very easily amused. I can just sit and look at rocks all day and be happy as a clam. I just love them. And then, of course, there are these beauties, which are from the sea, and different corals that wash up onto the beach. And I love to pick up pieces of coral wherever I can find them. And I just think they're so incredible. This particular collection of corals, however, is not mine. This is a photograph I took at as a sculptor's studio, actually, in Cape Town. And this is a person who had their collection of things that they love to look at. And one of his bowls was filled. He had this beautiful shallow bowl filled with these little pieces of coral that I'm sure he'd picked up on the beach. So this is one of my souvenirs, is taking a picture of it. This is my little studio assistant, Busy. She's actually not a very helpful studio assistant, except for now in her older, she's now sweet 16, I tell people. So she's less inclined to steal things from me back in the studio than she used to be. But when she was younger, she was really good at this. She would come in the room and stare at me. And if I didn't look up pretty quickly, then she would go over to my fabric stash and pull out a piece of fabric and come over and stare at me again with the fabric in her mouth. And then as soon as I look at her, she'd shake it and run off. But now she just tends to let me know when she thinks it's time for me to get up. And she's as good as your Apple Watch at that, how the Apple Watch will tell you it's time to stand.
Yes.
She's pretty good at that too. She'll come back and inform me it's time for her to go out, or it's time for her to have a treat or whatever. So in that way, I guess she's a pretty good studio assistant. Yep. This is another part of my studio. When I redid it, I had them cut a hole in the wall of my what was the bathroom is now my wet studio space. There was a useless bathtub and window there. So I said, let's just make that opening a little bit bigger, shall we? So we cut a door in the side wall. And I said, while you're at it, why don't you pour me a concrete slab out there? And they just looked at me like, what? And I said, just do it. I mean, make me as big of a concrete patio as you can. Doesn't have to be fancy. And so it's been great for me, because here we have, on the average, we have at least 3/4 of the year, we have sunshine. So some of it's intense sunshine. So there are days, certainly, when we have sunshine that one doesn't want to be out in the back too much. But I do love it when I can. I like to set up. I've got a couple of folding, adjustable height print tables. And then they're just regular Home Depot or, home supply tables. And I'll put them up to print table height, or counter height is where I like it when I'm working. And I just use padded insulation material on the surface of those print tables. And I have old bed sheets that I use as drop cloths. And this is where I do a lot of my surface design work with thickened dye. So when possible, I do like to work outside, and then I'll just shuttle back and forth to get more dye, print paste, and whatever, which is just inside that door. I have a big sink, and it's a perfect setup for me. It sort of looks like I'm that moonshine still thing. Look over on the left of the picture, which looks highly suspicious, I think. I always wonder what my next door neighbors, if they ever look out their upstairs window and wonder if I'm making moonshine or something. But actually, that's my homemade steamer. Right. So I roll up my fabric inside on a piece of landscape fencing, and it gets suspended down through the top of that stovepipe looking thing. And then I have a piece of wire I hang over the top of that, put a towel over it, put the lid on it. And then the base of it is, it's sitting in a tamale steamer, and that is sitting on top of a turkey fryer burner. It's such a hillbilly looking thing, but it's very effective. So anyway, yeah, it works. Here is my wet studio, much cleaner than usual, I might add. But I would say that I always feel like I need to pat myself on the back when my wet studio looks as clean. Usually I have something going on the print table. This table that's below the square light is a static table. It is on wheels, but I rarely move it around in the room. I'm almost always doing something on there. Sometimes if the weather is inclement, I will print in this room, but I prefer to print on a larger print surface whenever possible. So I can set up a long table in the studio, but it's always a little cozy. So when I don't have to, I usually don't. But I do a lot of work with acrylic paint, and I do a lot of mixed media work. And often this is the place, that table is where I do a lot of that. But I also mix dye there. You can see that I've got a big sink over across the room. So I've got everything pretty self-contained for my dye and paint work in this area. This is a little more realistic picture of my studio, although the table's still fairly clean. You can see that I've got a lot of action going over on on my uh, my sink area. The sink and that area was kind of mimics a restaurant sink. It was made for the space here, but I've got a double sink, very deep, big enough for silk screens to be cleaned off in, which was a big requirement. And then I do a lot of dyeing when I'm doing solids. I use the little blue things you can see up here on the counter are little tabletop washing machines. They're very basic. They just agitate. They don't add or subtract water. All that's done manually with a little hose that you can dispense a water from the machine, and you just add it through the top lid. I find these are very easy to use for when I'm trying to dye a solid color. So I use them a lot when I'm in that mode, which I
Okay.
apparently was when this picture was taken.
Yes. You're not teaching at
No,
the
I'm not
moment.
teaching. I'm not really teaching. No,
That's okay.
not
That's
really
okay.
teaching right now.
COVID's put a hold on many people's sort of activities. I'm teaching online, which has been really a lifesaver for me, and I'm actually really enjoying it. And I'm not quite sure I want to go back to doing the in-person stuff because there's a lot of travel and a lot of carrying heavy bags around. And so
I
being
hear you on that.
somewhere where you can just everybody has all their gear all there. They don't have to travel. I don't have to travel. So it's been very interesting. But COVID has certainly changed many of our lives.
I think you're right. And I would, and I've done a very small amount of teaching online. I'm not doing much of it, but I think that there's so many advantages on both sides of that equation. I think for the students, especially if a sewing machine is involved, often in a classroom setting where you're on an unfamiliar machine, there you're in your you're in your home studio. If you're a student, you've got a machine you're comfortable with, your whole stash is right there someplace close by. You didn't forget that one piece of fabric you wish you had that you didn't put in your suitcase.
Yeah,
So, and yeah, I don't think it's going away. I think online teaching, I mean, I think there'll be some kind of a hybrid version of
yeah. I hope so.
that
Anyway,
in the
I'm a
future.
long way away. You have,
Yeah,
however,
I do.
been creating a fabric line. This is your fifth or sixth fabric
Yes,
line that's just coming out soon.
yes,
And so all the details
yes.
and all of Leslie's links are down below in the information section. And the fabrics look beautiful, so I'm sure they'll be very popular. I'd like to thank you for being part of my little quilt story experiment, which is going quite well and getting a lot of really beautiful feedback. So I hope people will subscribe. There's a button that will pop up here, and I hope you'll click on the button and join us and watch the videos as they come up. I hope to see you in person
Well,
sometime.
thank you for having me, Lisa. It's so good to chat with you. Yes.
It's been fun. Okay, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.